but where you could like have a lower privileged user that maybe has group policy rights on a domain controller or an OU that holds domain controllers, I should say. And effectively you're a domain admin, right? Because you could go put, login scripts and other things or startup scripts in that GPO. And that's where I think it can get complex because, right, like we're focused on identity, but there's also attacks on like the other components of Active Directory that can lead to identity compromise, even though, right, like group policy isn't like a component of identity and access management aside from like being stuck into Active Directory. So
this is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is Jim McDonald. I'm here without Jeff today, but I'm here with a special guest, Eric Woodruff, who we've had on the podcast in the past. It's time for another Sponsor Spotlight episode. Now, Eric was on with us as a credentialed expert in the field in the past on episode 191. Glad to have him back this time on a Sponsor Spotlight episode. And the Sponsor Spotlight episodes are special episodes that are created in collaboration with our sponsor, in this case, a company called Semperis, to delve more deeply into their viewpoints on specific security solutions in the IAM market. Now, to make this crystal clear, it's a fully sponsored episode. This allows us to, what I like to say is take the handcuffs off in terms of understanding these deep insights with the expert, but also understanding how their solution solve specific problems in the industry. So with all that being said, let's get going and uncover the latest ideas and innovations with our within the digital identity industry and our sponsor, Semperis. So welcome to the show, Eric Woodruff, Senior Security Researcher with Semperis. Hey, Eric.
Hey, Jim. Thanks for having me on here.
Glad to have you today. So we spoke with you way back on episode 191. That was in December of 2022. And I'm wondering, what have you been up to since we recorded that episode?
I'd say a lot. I mean, honestly, that was the first podcast I was ever on. And I was nervous. So I hope I come across less anxious these days. But just chugging away still at Semperis, working in our security research team these days, focusing on Active Directory and Entra ID sort of security. So, out speaking about which I enjoy. Yeah,
pretty heady title that you got, Senior Security Researcher at Semperis. So tell us a little bit about what you do in your day-to-day, and then for people who maybe aren't as familiar with Semperis, what the company does.
Yeah, no, I mean, so for myself, I'd say there's always kind of new emerging threats around Active Directory, Entra ID. I in particular am more focused on Entra because that's kind of my area of expertise. But we've got a team of, handful of us where you were just sort of, tracking the trends in security around identity, new threats, doing our own research on potential vulnerabilities, things like that. That's what I'm up to and do. And eventually the stuff that we work on is released in both Purple Knight, which is one of our free products for assessing Active Directory and Entra security, and also used within our commercial product, DSP, which is Directory Services Protector. And as far as Semperis, we're probably most known for Active Directory Forest Recovery, or ADFR, which is our sort of like DR product for Active Directory. But I think these days, we'd be sort of in the category of ITDR companies, again, focused primarily on Active Directory and Entra right now. We got a little Okta mixed in there, but.
Yeah, pretty much most organizations are running AD and Entra ID at some level. And it's like, and usually it's about, as important of a platform as there is in most enterprises. And, I think that ADFR tools probably saved a lot of people's bacon in terms of being able to recover forest that has been corrupted intentionally or unintentionally. Either one can happen. But I wanted to ask you, so I kind of said my piece in terms of why I think AD is so important in terms of being a focal point for identity security. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to find a enterprise out there that doesn't have Active Directory, right? Sort of like putting your opinion about Active Directory and Microsoft aside, like, but everyone's kind of got it. There's other components in Active Directory like group policy, right? Like, it's not just identity, which also makes it more complex because if you have a huge Windows server farm or you're not in the cloud yet and you're managing client devices, right? Like, it just has its fingers in sort of so many things that if Active Directory is gone, intentionally, unintentionally, even for a brief period of time, right? I mean, a lot of organizations, business just grinds to a complete halt. So,
yeah, I mean, that's your email system, your login system for your desktop, networking capabilities. It's a lot of your applications wind up being integrated with it as well for authentication, sometimes authorization. So, I mean, I want to talk about some of the specific threats you as the senior security researcher know about, but I also want to just generally make the comment that it seems like a ransomware on Active Directory could have devastating effects for an enterprise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm not good at retaining like specific cases or statistics in my head, but organizations, right, will lose millions of dollars a day. We have folks that work in incident response, right? So if companies are having like an Active Directory ransomware incident, we have our breach preparedness and response team that you can call, and we'll kind of come in and help try to kick the threat actor out. But in talking to them and sort of hearing like their war stories and what they've seen, it can be very devastating. I mean, there's cases of companies just like going out of business from Active Directory becoming ransomware. So it goes back to if it's unavailable, nothing works.
We saw some cases, in the last couple of years where ransoms got paid in the tens of millions of dollars. I guess the alternative is like if your Active Directory is completely owned and you can't get email, you can't communicate with the outside world, access any of your files or your applications, you're pretty much at the mercy of those ransomware actors, right?
Yeah, you're at their mercy, but also they're not always the most trustworthy folks. Because there's times where organizations will get ransomed and they'll pay the ransom and they'll be like double extorted. They'll also be a target, right? So you maybe fixed one, you plugged up one hole in the dam, but if there's other things open also, like other ransomware groups may start to come after you knowing that you'll pay, right? So there's a lot of scenarios where it can get dicey whether you pay the ransom or not, because you're probably going to become a higher target for these folks out there, the threat actors.
Oh, absolutely. Once you kind of show that you'll pay the ransom, then it's kind of like damned if you do, damned if you don't, I guess. But I think at least from what I've seen, the ransomware actors typically they rely on just getting in the front door and then running some exploits that are kind of like known within Active Directory. And, I can, the pass the hash one is one that people talk about all the time, and the Mimikatz, which I think is just basically the tool that's used for that. But I used to be an Active Directory administrator, believe it or not, way back in NT4 in the early days of Active Directory after Windows 2000. And I just think of all the times I logged into end devices, laptops, and workstations with my administrator account and left that hash sitting there on the hard drive. How relevant is pass the hash, and what are some of the other exploits that are popular these days?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say pass the hash is still relevant, right? It's really as much of a a technique, right, where you're harvesting the hash for user credentials on a Windows device usually, and right, depending on what privileges that user has, you may then try to use it to sort of move into other systems. I mean, there's a lot of attacks out there. Probably the more sort of talked about ones are things like a golden ticket attack, DC shadow, DC sync attacks. But I think the thing that's sort of interesting is most of these attacks are sort of like late stage, post compromise, like a domain admin's already been owned. Like golden ticket in particular is effectively that the KRB TGT password has been compromised, and that's sort of used for everything else in Active Directory.
What is that again? Can you explain that for
so there's the Kerberos ticket granting ticket. So basically there's an account in Active Directory that is used for granting tickets for everything else in Active Directory. And this account is like a special account in AD. It's the KRB TGT. Right. Again, if say I own a domain admin, or I work my way up onto like a DC, and I can get the password essentially for that account. I mean, at that point, I am like Active Directory. I can do sort of whatever I want. And it becomes really difficult to really trust, right, Active Directory. Like, even if you were to detect a golden ticket attack happening, you really should also be like concerned about the overall, the bigger state of AD, because right, say that attack it was legitimate, and maybe say you have an EDR that's sort of like tried to isolate the endpoint that it was detected on. You probably still have bigger problems because you don't necessarily know what else the threat actor has done at that point. So,
right. That's what you had mentioned to me in the past about not being in a position where you don't trust your Active Directory. That's a scary thought. What does that stem from?
I mean, so ultimately, like the problem I'd say is that there are certain types of attacks on Active Directory that they require high privilege, but they allow the attacker to basically do things like where they can issue tickets for basically any service or any server, right? And the ticket is effectively like you can be anyone, do anything with like a golden ticket type attack. Other things like DC Shadow, where you are effectively sort of participating in Active Directory replication. And that can become tricky because a lot of your event logs and things that like a SIM or SIEM may use can't pick up on that stuff because it's actually in like the replication stream. But where this all kind of goes from a trust perspective, right, is like, right, like you don't necessarily know what other mechanisms of persistence that have been installed. And I guess kind of bringing this back to some of the ransomware type things is one of the other issues that like IR teams will have is they'll be brought in a decently compromised Active Directory. They'll try to kick the threat actor out, but then they've installed like 5 other back doors at that point, right? And so now they're coming back in a different way. And sometimes this comes down to where you have this back and forth because Active Directory is really critical for, authentication and in both AD and these days also, out into like Entra ID, Azure AD. Your best bet really is to try to go back to like a known good state with Active Directory using something like ADFR, where you can go back to before the incident happened and basically bring Active Directory back up to a point in time where it's a known good state. And there's some like work kind of involved, right? Because usually it's like staging it isolated, where you verify that it's like clean and good, and then you sort of open the doors to let other infrastructure kind of talk back to it. So
it's a scary thought, right? I mean, this ADFR to me has always been like the holy grail, but you also hear about threat actors who, they get in and then they sit silently for long periods of time. And how would you know if basically they compromise a legitimate user's credentials 6 months ago, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets into definitely also other aspects of more like proactive, monitoring, and I guess I would lean more into like DSP, and some of it would be in Purple Knight, which is our free, AD and Enter ID security assessment tool. But there's other things, right, where it's more like proactively monitoring, especially your privileged accounts, and that kind of dovetails out into, right, that some of these identity attacks are complex, or they're chained, or there's things that right, you may not think of. And I think a great example, because honestly, like I managed Active Directory back in the day, and sort of like my eyes became open even more when I joined Semperis. But where you could like have a lower privileged user that maybe has group policy rights on a domain controller, or an OU that holds domain controllers, I should say. And effectively you're a domain admin, right? Because you could go put, login scripts and other things, or startup scripts in that GPO. And that's where I think it can get complex, because, right, like we're focused on identity, but there's also attacks on like the other components of Active Directory that can lead to identity compromise, even though, right, like group policy isn't like a component of identity and access management, aside from like being stuck into Active Directory. So
Eric, you said one word that really triggered my ears to go up, and that was the word free.
Yeah.
You mentioned a tool, and it's kind of like, because where I wanted to go was what are some of the tools that can save your bacon in a scenario, or hopefully prior to this all taking place. You mentioned the restore tool. You also had mentioned a few other tools. So why don't you kind of go over what those tools are? You guys are setting up a link at semperis.com/IDAC, all in caps. If you go to that URL, you should be able to find everything that Eric's talking about. We'll put that link in the show notes as well. But Eric, could you kind of go over those tools again?
Yeah. So the soup of things, I guess I'll start off with a couple free tools that we have. So there's Purple Knight, and this has, and I should know this number because it's the group I work in, but it's continually growing. Between Entra and Active Directory, I think we're up to around 170, 180 security indicators, right? And so these are individual things that are measuring the security configuration, or sort of lack thereof, around Active Directory, Enter ID. The other tool is Forest Druid, that's free, which is a attack path analysis, attack path mapping tool, right? So that will also help, right, you sort of visualize and see like how chained attacks could happen, where, right, like I am in our help desk and I have the ability to reset the password on someone who is in our NOC, and that person in the NOC that's like a sort of higher tier has the ability to maybe manage group policies on your ADFS servers, right? And that's, as I'm speaking this, right, it's kind of a path, but like something like Forest Druid would help you visualize that stuff. And that's in the realm of other tools, like, right, probably the most, I guess, say well-known would be things like Bloodhound or whatnot. We have a bit of a different take where we try to focus on the last sort of stage in the path, right? That if you cut off the last line before getting like domain admin, I mean, you still may have other cleanup, but right, wanting to focus on, well, how do we protect like that tier 0, the keys to the kingdom.
But these are tools that could take you above and beyond what Bloodhound could do, right?
Yeah, I mean, so like I would say Forest Druid and Bloodhound, they're very related. We kind of have a different take on how we go about analysis. Because sometimes, right, you could look in Bloodhound, and I mean, I think it's a great tool, but generally it's more red team sort of oriented, where you really need to know a lot of the underpinnings. Forest Druid is designed to be more like for an IT pro, a defender, an identity person who maybe isn't super familiar with like all the nuances of attack path management, right? They just want to see like, what are the things I need to get rid of to like protect my domain admins? So,
okay, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, good. So there's a link that people can go out to. They'll be able to navigate their way to the free tools, as well as, I'm assuming that part of the business model of building free tools is that people see all these problems and they're willing to go and spend a little money to prevent being attacked.
Yep. So, and that's absolutely like, again, for the paid products. So we have Active Directory Forest Recovery, which is ADFR. I think maybe mentioned earlier, it's what we're probably most well known for, and that's bringing Active Directory back from being burned to the ground. There's a lot of organizations that also, to I think a point you made earlier, can have catastrophic sort of oopsies where there's an operational sort of benefit to ADFR to bring AD back. Some organizations use it for DR testing and like going through those DR drills where it's like, right, what's it actually take to bring Active Directory back? And I'll actually say, as someone who again used to manage AD, not until I worked here did I realize how complex it is to manually try to bring Active Directory back from like a system state restore. And unless you want to enjoy doing nothing for like the next couple of weeks, it can be a nightmare. Probably
when you say enjoy doing nothing, you're talking about you're going to be working 80 hours a week for the next few weeks and getting yelled at probably. I don't envy people who are stuck in that. Now, we've been talking about AD as in classic AD primarily. You guys are really focused on the future as well, this hybrid identity world. In fact, you've got a conference coming up called the Hybrid Identity Protection, aka HIP, the HIP conference. We have a discount code for the HIP conf. It's hipconf.com. Discount code is IDAC pod. That'll get you 20% off. But Eric, could you tell people what they can kind of expect out of that conference?
Yeah, absolutely. So the conference is actually rooted in Gil Kirkpatrick, who you folks actually had on quite a long time ago, who had started the Directory Experts Conference. And it's an evolution of that where it's a lot of the bigger names in Active Directory identity security that are going to be there, as well as Entra security. I can't remember the roster, but like Sean Metcalf over at Trimark is like a pretty well-known person. I think well, I'll start to ramble.
A lot of Microsoft MVPs and stuff like that, right?
Yep. Yeah. Thomas Neuenheim, who's actually a very well-known MVP in the Entra space, is going to be talking about, I think, enterprise applications and service principles and all that sort of stuff. So, and this is where I guess to the hybrid piece, right? We're really trying to cover both Active Directory and the Entra ID side of the house, sort of everything under the Microsoft ecosystem. So,
yeah, I mean, it's so big right now. So, hybrid identity is, I think, it's the new thing or the next thing, but it's also the current thing. I mean, if people haven't moved to Entra ID already for a lot of the Active Directory services, they're moving to it. I don't see an end of life for Active Directory on-prem anytime soon, but I see a lot of folks, a lot of organizations moving toward kind of this hybrid scenario where they have both, they're staying in sync. I'm kind of wondering, though, what kind of new threats does that create, as well as what kind of opportunities it creates?
Yeah, I mean, from a threat perspective, it can get interesting in, again, organizations sort of unknowingly will perhaps have a user that's not privileged in Active Directory, but privileged in Entra, right? And so from an Active Directory sort of protection perspective, the user sort of falls out of that privileged scope. And sort of the long story short is scenarios of a user being compromised, like in Active Directory, and then whoever has compromised them being able to do stuff in Entra. There's also some interesting scenarios where you can almost have this almost like loop back where you could compromise someone that has some privileges in Entra, usually around something like Azure. Like you have an Azure subscription and maybe you're running domain controllers that are virtualized out in Azure. You compromise someone that has some amount of rights over a domain controller from like a management plane perspective. And you can then go run commands sort of against the domain controller because, right, they're virtualized. There's an agent on them, as there is in pretty much any sort of virtualization scenario, that the agent has system level access. And next thing you know, you've given yourself domain admin through some cloud route. So yeah, there's a lot of like these weird complex paths that just, it's like spaghetti almost with the number of potential ways that you can compromise in these hybrid scenarios. So
yeah, if you don't really know what you're doing, or even if you do, that's the problem, right? It's like, even if you do know what you're doing, you can still wind up creating one of these scenarios. And I think that's a big part of the tooling that you guys at Semperis, what you provide to people is the ability to kind of identify those scenarios where you create an opening.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that but you'll definitely encounter people at times who will sort of say they can just roll their own, or their Sentinel or their Splunk or their QRadar is kind of good enough. But right, it's I'd say not just a Semperis argument that any company working in the ITDR space, right? Like most of us as different companies have a group of identity security nerds sitting there all day trying to work on this stuff full time. And just seeing the things out there that actually happen, right? Because we have feedback from our IR team, right? Who they're like, here are things we've seen, right? So we're not just like sitting there making stuff up as sort of like theoretical attack paths. Yeah, it can be quite scary. And I'll just say, to your point, like, yeah, even if you know what you're doing, everything just moves so quick these days that I think it's really hard for organizations to keep on top of things, right? And again, that's where like for our other product, DSP, that's more like looking at the proactive security of Active Directory and Entra, as well as some indicators of compromise or attacks in flight. We're working on this thing every month. We have a monthly release of new indicators or updates for indicators, all based on, right, the data we're seeing, the research that we're doing. And so I'd sort of politely argue to the roll your own people, right? Like, how can you sort of keep up like this, right? I mean, if you are, you have to be investing a ton of time and money and resources into doing it.
It's rare. When I first started in this identity industry, it was much more common that organizations would start off with a build versus buy analysis.
Yeah.
It's very rare these days. Once in a blue moon, somebody will want to look at it. Usually it's having to do with customer identity. But
yep.
The assumption is we're not in the business of security, information security, when to buy products and run them. And then there is a major trust level in the partners that organizations choose. I think what I really like about what you guys are doing is it seems like you've got a focus.
Yep.
While the products have to evolve, it's been centered on this AD, Entra ID platform, and you're continuing to grow into that. Now, one of the other areas that I know you guys have been growing into, and to me, it seems like it's the right direction, is ITDR. I'm going to ask you first, like, how do you define ITDR? And then ask you, who needs it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, well, I'll answer the second question first and saying I think everyone needs it, but across, I mean, right, that's kind of an answer that's that I used to consult. It's like it depends within as to what that spectrum of needs it is. But to the first thing, I actually like Gartner's ITDR sort of model that they have, right? And it's identity threat detection and response. I think in the industry, though, it's a bit all over the place as to how people actually interpret it. And I actually think that probably two of the most important pieces, the prevention, which isn't in the name, but it is in the Gartner model, and the response piece are the ones that kind of get left out, and everyone's just like focused on, right, like the detection, or if it's prevention, it's more like how can we obfuscate something? How can we like throw the threat actor off instead of, I don't know. To me, prevention's like how can we go in as the IT pros or the people managing identity and right turn the knobs and dials to just make Active Directory more secure instead of trying to throw a bunch of like fancy sounding things at it to sort of not actually harden Active Directory, but just try to interfere with an attack. So I had some.
Yeah,
maybe I think
that. No. I think that was a good start to the conversation, and I think ITDR could be like many other tools in identity, where they focus on the enterprise and all the different systems that could be compromised. But I find so many organizations are so heavily Microsoft centric that they're using AD or Entra ID, including the MFA system, all through Microsoft. So if that's the basket where most of your eggs are, having a tool that's hyper focused on that seems like it could make sense. That kind of. Well, where I was going with that was, that seems like I'm maybe answering this next question, which is, why does it matter what vendor I choose for my ITDR solution?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think right. I'm here being sponsored, right? Biased towards Semperis, but I also think that being hyper focused piece is where we excel. And right, like I'm all about having layers of security. So it's certainly nothing against like XDR platforms. I think what I tend to find, and previously I was on our product team and I was involved in a lot of our competitive analysis. So I've also like looked at all the other competitors. Like XDRs tend to be really focused on like, again, like attacks in flight, and there isn't really a component in them like, well, what if something gets through, right? It kind of feels like you're betting a lot of money on like that. They will absolutely 100% stop anything and everything, like no questions asked. I think with Semperis in particular, like looking at how we interpret response is really like that, trying to get Active Directory or Entra back to a place that you trust, right? Like where you can feel confident that the directory service that you're looking at isn't something that's been tampered with. And that's where there's fewer companies out there kind of working in that space of providing like forest recovery, or now we also have tooling that we're working on for bringing like Entra sort of back and objects back into Entra. So if that, I feel like it's a big question, so I could just probably keep on on going.
No, for sure. I mean, a lot of organizations have made a big investment in their SIM solution over the years. And a lot of times folks just ask the question, what can ITDR do that my SIM solution can't do? And, they kind of see the SIM solution as identifying events that have taken place. My answer has always been it's the R. It's the detection should detect more things, right? So it's kind of like, if you think of like the Iron Dome analogy, right? Shooting missiles out of the sky or whatever. It's identifying more missiles, and then the response is that it can take them out. Just an analogy I made up, but how do you respond when people kind of come to you with, can I just get by with Splunk?
Yeah, I'd say it's back to I think there's three components. Is one, I think, like I was saying earlier, that you'll probably have a hard time sort of going one for one against a company that focuses in the space and having all the detections. I think the response piece is also the huge one, because again, like, it's one of those things where it's tough because you don't know until it happens to you what it can look like. But whether it's like object level recovery, right? And there's scenarios where the Active Directory recycling bin like is not necessarily good enough. So there's some, again, well, we're mostly focused on security operational benefits to the response portion. But again, like I would just argue to any company who's sort of like, we've got the response covered, would ask them to actually go try to bring Active Directory back from the grave, right? And I'm not talking about pretending to bring one domain controller back. Like, bring Active Directory back, bring it up so that your enterprise could actually use it for whatever it is that you do, and measure how long that takes, how many resources it takes, right? Like, sort of what the cost is there. Because a lot of organizations don't go through a real sort of almost like tabletop of that, or actually go through the process, right? They just look at their DR plan and they're like, well, we've got, a general backup solution, or we've got system state restore and check, and like, right, we're on to the next thing. And then when something actually happens, to my point earlier about you sort of hating life as the person who has to bring things back.
We've had guests come on and talk about getting cyber insurance. And the keys to getting cyber insurance, there were three things from an InfoSec perspective, or I should say from an IT perspective. So it was EDR, it was MFA, and backups. And so to me, the question around backups is not just do you have backups, but could you restore in a given scenario? So, I mean, in my earlier days in IT, whenever I was responsible for disaster recovery, the idea was some 9/11 type event or some natural disaster takes off data center. To me, that's not the most likely scenario. To me, the most likely scenario is some threat actor who gets a credential and then tries to take down your key infrastructure. And if Active Directory is part of your key infrastructure and they get a hold of it, just restoring from tape, it's not like that, right? And so that's where what you're saying comes into play. I think EDR kind of feels a lot like, EDR is EDR, but from an identity perspective, it feels a lot like ITDR, and I think MFA is expected as part of this hybrid identity protection, because I was going to talk a little bit earlier about opportunities with the hybrid cloud. Well, it seems to me if you are in a situation where you're going to continue to have an on-prem AD, which I think a lot of organizations are in that boat. They just don't see,
Yep.
they don't see a time until they close all of their offices. They don't see a time where an on-prem AD is not going to be part of the picture. Then having the MFA come from Entra is going to be a big key. So, I mean, this ability to recover from an intentional disaster, a lot different than a hurricane or something like that happening.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So I think to your point, like if you use that cyber insurance model, this is in the top 3. Eric, any closing thoughts? Just to kind of summarize everything we talked about.
Yeah, I have a couple. I guess I was just going to say too. I think one point with the backup piece, you encounter a lot of enterprises where their enterprise backup software relies on Active Directory, right? And nobody really notices or thinks that until they can't get into backup platform because Active Directory is down. They've built that dependency in, and now you're in the chicken and egg sort of scenario, except in a bad way because you don't have one to bootstrap the other. No, I mean, I think as far as the points I personally have liked to drive with customers is, on the prevention piece of things. So earlier this year, there was Windows Server 2025 coming out, and that actually kind of goes to your point of Active Directory not really going anywhere anytime soon. But Microsoft had this virtual conference, and I did a session that I called, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of detection. And the whole point I was trying to make in it was a lot of security people are so hyper-focused on the detection of attacks, which I won't argue that it's not important, but there's so many ways we could just prevent a golden ticket from happening, right? And that's the part where I wish security, infrastructure, whoever owns identity, that there was more of an investment in the proactive security piece of things, right? Because honestly, then I'm not saying you don't need cyber insurance, but if you harden the exterior, if you make it more difficult for a threat actor to really, pass the hash or perform a golden ticket attack, they're also opportunistic, right? So there are also scenarios where it might just be, right, a threat actor is going after 5 different people, the 2 that they can get domain admin in are the ones that they're going to focus on, and the others where maybe it's unfruitful, right? They just kind of move on. And yeah, I probably already, I guess I'd say, hit on it somewhat, but I think the other part is that response, right? Because a lot of times, again, I'd say kind of in the security industry, the feeling is response is we've detected an attack and we're going to isolate the node, right? Again, I think from a layered approach, this is all good. We've detected golden ticket and we're going to use EDR to isolate where we saw it coming from. But in those scenarios where it might be actually too late based on the type of attack that you've detected, but I think response really is getting into that almost DR piece of things, response needing to be, how do we get Active Directory back to a place or a state where we can trust everything in it? Right? Because if you can't honestly trust the state of Active Directory, then you honestly can't absolutely say, how do we know that there isn't something from a threat actor still lingering in here, right? And as again, we see in reality out there that these scenarios happen where they'll get you and then they'll get you again after you've paid up or not paid up. So
you made a great point earlier where you're talking about layers of security. It sounds to me like Semperis says the prevention. So in other words, examining your Active Directory and providing a map. And this is the Druid tool I think you talked about, providing a map of here's where your vulnerabilities are. And I love that point about an ounce of prevention worth a pound of detection.
Yep.
Because if you can cut off, here's the way I see it. Most organizations are not going to be the target of a day zero vulnerability, right? So that it's the attackers try to get in the door and then run scripts.
Yep.
And they run scripts and they run scripts. Well, those scripts essentially are vulnerabilities that have been found, and tools and scripts have been created to leverage those vulnerabilities, right? So if you have proper tooling in place to cut off those vulnerabilities, those scripts won't work in your environment. And so I think that's great. Now, detection potentially would detect something that is new, that is novel, right? And that, there isn't really a pattern for. And I think if you are the FBI or some organization where it's like, that's a really high value target and we're going to use day zero attacks if we can get our hands on them, nation state actors and things like that, that's a different ballgame. And I still think you have to be in the prevention side. You have to prevent what you can prevent, but you also have to be able to detect more.
Yep.
I think that you're making the case that for most organizations, prevention is going to be the key. So it's, scanning your environment, setting up the prevention. It's also the detection. So you have an ITDR system that is detecting. It's giving you another layer of defense. And then finally, if you are compromised, if all else fails, and you get owned, you still have the ability to restore your Active Directory.
Yep.
What I like is that you guys are so focused on the AD area. It's not a small area by any means, but it's a focal point. And for a lot of organizations, that's where their crown jewels lie, and their ability to control their environment lies within that realm.
Absolutely. And I think in general, at least at Semperis, like that's where, we would generally say that we're complementary to like XDR platforms, right? Like, because I think in that layered approach, right, we all kind of bring our benefits to protecting identity. I mean, in the bigger picture, right, I think especially from the layered piece of things, because we just continue to see, right, sort of any identity attack, it is so crucial, right? I mean, I have other talks that I've done about right, identity being the new security perimeter, and we've been saying this since 2012, as far back as I could find articles. Right, to me, it's like sort of like, when are we going to drop the new part of identity is the new security perimeter, and just like say, right, it is the security perimeter these days, and actually treat identity security as like the sort of first class sort of customer it should be in the enterprise. So, but I mean, I could go on tangents probably.
You go on for years about that, right? But it's a great point. We've been calling it the new perimeter for so long. Like, why don't we just call it the perimeter? And it's because with the layered security approach, there still are firewalls.
Oh yeah.
They don't catch everything, but they block a lot.
Yeah.
They block a lot.
They are, but I would just say that's where it gets sticky with, right, the cloud, because a lot of the more traditional defenses that we have, we can't easily apply to, like, SaaS applications and all that sort of stuff, because, right, the interface that all of our end users log into or authenticate through, right, is the same one that threat actors can go hit. And I won't ramble about it too much, but just I think to the point you made earlier about sort of time, money, resources, and how it's tough on people who even know what they're doing. It kind of goes back to that. There's just everything's so fast these days that you can be the best of the best and still have trouble sort of keeping up with it all. So
yeah, absolutely. So, Eric, any other closing thoughts?
No, I think
Good, because I've been wanting to ask you. I know you're really into hiking,
yeah.
and you had mentioned to me that you blew out your ACL. What was it, in April? We're sitting here in August at this point, recording this episode, and I want to hear more about that. Like, what was the recovery like?
Oh, it was not fun. So actually, my son is huge into skiing, and I never skied, even though I've grown up in the Northeast in my life. And this winter in January, I was taking skiing lessons. My instructor had me going on a slope that was a little too adventurous. I got my skis caught up, heard a pop in my knee, and then going to the orthopedic doctor. It was kind of a bit of time. I had some fracture in my leg that they had to let heal. So yeah, end of April, I had surgery. Man, that was rough. And I actually had a podcast recording. Like, my surgery was like on a Thursday, and I think it was that next Monday I had some sort of podcast recording set, and I didn't realize how intense even the first week of healing would be. Because, man, I saw myself in that recording, and I feel like I looked and sounded like a hot mess from still being on meds
and a lot of opioids and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I couldn't. My leg was completely, like, I had it propped up like under the desk. It was, but the recovery has been tough, man. Like, I'm still not allowed to run or jump, and I can't believe just how little bit of surgery it is in a way on your leg, how much it sets you back, because it is a tough thing to recover from. So,
yeah, did you wind up gaining any weight while you've been off your feet?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm up and walking around, and if you saw me walking down the street, you'd probably think nothing is sort of wrong with my leg at this point, but. No, because also when I'm feeling down, I love binge eating, so it's just been cyclical. I can't go out and hike.
Join the club, baby.
Ice cream. Yeah.
Join the club. Well, yeah, I never actually had any kind of surgery on my knees or anything, but I did have a hernia a couple of years ago now, and like people said, "Oh, you had to stay off your feet for a few days." I didn't realize, like, those first 48 hours or so, because it was a outpatient surgery. So you go in and get the surgery, they knock you out. Yep. You wake up 5 minutes later and the surgery's all in the past. But then the recovery winds up taking a couple of months. And it's the first couple of days that are the worst.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It is brutal, right? And I'm not a spring chicken anymore or whatnot. So, but yeah, it's made for a less than ideal summer in some ways, but we're going on vacation actually tomorrow with the family for about a week to the Netherlands, and looking forward to still doing summery things and enjoying life away from identity.
Netherlands is one of my favorite countries. What I would recommend, if you can, is get outside of Amsterdam a little bit. Amsterdam is like super cool, but it's also like touristy, and it's a big city. And if you get out into the, going from city to city, or maybe get into some of the smaller towns, you're really going to enjoy it. I mean, it's a beautiful country. And, I think most people know they have a dike system that pumps water out. Otherwise, most of the country would be below water. Yeah. And so it creates, like, there's all these, I guess they're dikes that channel the water out. And the windmill, the purpose was to operate the pumps to pump the water out. Pretty ingenious. And just a beautiful country, a lot of farmland.
Yep.
So try to get out there and explore. I spent a lot of time in Leiden. It's a city that you can take a train from Amsterdam right there. So, anyway, you enjoy that.
Yeah, I will.
Eric, is there anything else, or I guess we can wrap up this episode? I think it's been really educational.
Good. I'm glad. No, I think If you let me go too long, I'll just keep going forever. So I'd say we could probably wrap it.
All right. Well, good. I think the first thing I wanted to do is remind everybody about the HIP conference.
Yep.
You can go to hipconf.com. I was out at the website already. The conference is what, December or November 13th and 14th?
I think it's in November. Now I can't remember if it's 12th, 13th, or 13th, 14th. It says at the site.
It says it on the website. That's
yep.
right. So if you go to hipconf.com, if you do decide to register, if you look at the awesome speaker list, use the discount code IDAC POD, IDAC POD. Will get you 20% off. It's the best discount code that's out there and available. You also find this podcast on any podcast platform that you want to listen to, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or there's a million others that are much smaller, and we're available on all of them. We are also available on YouTube. If you go to idacpodcast.tv, it'll take you right to our YouTube page. We would appreciate if you enjoy the podcast to go out there and subscribe, check us out. We're putting up new content at least every week, and we're trying to do even more than that with like stories and outtakes. We have our own website, idacpodcast.com, and we're on Twitter or X with the @ IDAC podcast. We're also on Mastodon. Now, I've never been to that myself, but it's at IDAC podcast at infosec.exchange. And our sponsor for this week is Semperis or Semperis. I was told by Eric before the episode that both are used pretty commonly and interchangeably.
Yep.
And so it's at Semperis or Semperis.com, SEMPERIS.com. And we'll have all those notes in the show note. So for this week, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.